And I'll also say that I'm Jessica Hum, so I am a land use planner. I moved to the Tlicho region just over 2 years ago from Vancouver and originally from Toronto. My background is Chinese, as well as my father never knew his nation, where he was from. He was adopted into a Chinese family. So we come from descendants of immigrants as well as original people here. And I am fortunate to be learning quite a bit from the new home that I'm living in, and this is part of my story to tell you. If some of you were in the presentation this morning, also with the title Reconciliation, Lessons from the Northwest Territories, that was a great introduction to some of the history of land use planning in the Northwest Territories, and this piece sort of picks up where that left off. This will be a case study. This will be really I'm going to speak from what I know, which is working with the Tlicho for the past few years, implementing their land use plan and working towards a new land use plan for the surrounding lands outside of Tlicho lands. When I first thought about what we were going to share here, I developed this presentation with an elder from the Tlicho region who had been assisting us in our traditional knowledge research. And we started to think about resiliency and what that means in our communities and for making decisions about our lands. And I took this definition off of an English dictionary, Webster's, which has 3 different definitions for reconciliation. And the phonetic spelling of reconciliation is not in the Tlicho language, it's how it's phonetically spelled. But I zeroed in on the 3rd definition, which really is also about financial, but it has to do with harmonization. And that from the perspective of the making of laws of the land speaks volumes. Harmonization to us is a way that 2 groups, 2 peoples can come to their own decisions on their own and then bring those decisions together and find ways that they work together. And I think that's really what we are trying to do with our initiatives in lands and resource decisions. So today I will be sharing with you about, we'll start of course with some ancient stories about the Dene Way, which underlines the importance of land, or de as it's pronounced in Tlicho, to the Dene in the north, especially to the Tlicho in terms of defining their rules and the laws about the land. And then we'll talk about building traditional knowledge, building capacity in our organization, and informing the ways we make decisions based in traditional knowledge. And then I'll introduce the Tlicho Land Use Plan, which was created in 2013, finalized in 2013, and coming up for a review, 5-year review of the Tlicho Land Use Plan, and its foundation from the Tlicho Agreement, the modern day land claim. And then we will wrap up by talking about our collaborations, recent collaborations, as well as past collaborations, and our future looking towards reconciliation and harmonization. So where I live, my home is in Tłįchło, which is, as the raven flies, 1,200 kilometers north from here, from Calgary. The Tlicho region has 4 communities. Its population is just over 3,100 people. My community of Tłįchło has 2,154 people. The other 3 communities we call the outlying communities. They're accessible only by airplane or by winter road for the short winter road season from January to March. And those communities are Wek'èezhìi, which has 549 people. Gamati has 271. And Wek'èezhìi is the smallest community and the most closest to the tree line. It has 148 population. And these communities were very much centered around being able to access caribou. Particularly Wek'èezhìi is very close to the tree line where community members can access their traditional foods. And these communities still exist now on Winter Road, where people can access by float plane or come out on the winter to access non-traditional foods, work, services, all of the things that they need now on a daily basis. I will start first when we think about whose land is it and who's making decisions about that land, with our introduction of what has been taught to me of the Dene Way. And I have a quote from George Erasmus, who is the past national chief of the Assembly of First Nations. George said, "Long before the Europeans decided to look for the East and discovered this land, the Dene lived here. We had our own way of life. We have our own laws by which we governed ourselves. We have our own young people, and the laws governed the young people, and we had our own ways of worship, our education system. We had a complete way of life, and we called ourselves Dene." A painting of Yamoza, as he's known in the Tlicho region, or Yamoria, as he's known further up the Mackenzie River. Here, because for the Dene, Yamoza or Yamoria was the great traveler. He was known as the one who traveled through many different regions and dedicated his life to making laws and setting the world right for people and animals to live together. So he really had a foundation, and his legends and his stories still live on today in what we know as Dene laws. Every landmark and every landscape feature in the land has a story attached to it that involves Yamoza. And so we can start with that as a foundation for understanding the importance of land. Dene laws do prove that long before Europeans arrived to make treaties, there were rules that governed protection of land and culture and a way of life. The Tlicho have traveled the land by dog team in winter and canoes in the summer. And this concept of day, of land, it has a broader meaning than the English word land. It can refer to a whole ecosystem or an environment. And we have traditional knowledge researchers who have written, Elise Legat, Georgina Chocolate, and Sally Ann Zoe. This is an often quoted definition of day. They say where ecosystem is based on the idea that living things exist in association with non-living elements. The dog rib term day is based on the idea that everything in the environment has life and spirit. So we really start from that foundation, and I'm sharing with you here a quote from Chief Mulpui, who was the chief at the time of the signing of Treaty 11 in 1921, who translated the definition or his interpretation of the treaty to the people, and he said, "As long as the sun rises and the river flows and the land does not move, we shall not be restricted from our way of life." This definition translates into the Tlicho flag, which has the water flowing and the sun rising. And it's also the foundation for the modern day treaty. In that treaty, which was signed and ratified in 2005, the Tlicho Agreement was the first self-government and land claim comprehensive agreement in the Northwest Territories. It followed 3 finalized land claim agreements. In 1984, the Inuvialuit. In 1992, the Gwich'in. And in 1994, the Sahtu, Dene, and Métis final agreement. And just recently, in the past year, Delaney, the community of Delaney on Great Bear Lake, has also signed a community land claim agreement. So we're seeing these treaties revisited and these original interpretations honored through our modern treaties. But back to land use decisions, back to how we do our planning in our spheres. I have heard from the elders in a meeting, in working with our elders, them turn to each other and say in Tlicho, "You are our scientists." And the definition for the word scientist is one who knows best about medicine, one who knows how the land can heal us and how we can heal the land. The elders that we work with have always been monitoring the land. They've been taught at an early age how to listen and how to watch the land. And elders are passing on their knowledge, particularly through telling stories, particularly through not necessarily getting from A to B, but from sharing their whole understanding of day, of the ecosystem, of all the living and interconnected beings. Our elders talk about the changing climate, high and low water levels, about wildfires and good fishing and hunting grounds. And they tell us these important things so that we can make the best decisions as well. So I'll also introduce this as a case study, a way that we have found to document our process of collecting traditional knowledge that informs how we make our lands and resource decisions. Whenever we have meetings with elders, especially on land use planning, we've been asked to bring young people from all our Tlicho communities and to have youth and elders working side by side to make their decisions about monitoring and respecting the land. The Tłįchło government has built capacity in traditional knowledge research, particularly as the land use plan was being created and drafted. We were building capacity in our language and our understanding of place names, and that capacity has continued on. So we've retained the talent and the expertise of people in building self-government as well. If folks are familiar with working with traditional knowledge, it is important to follow a series of steps. And these are the steps in general that we take, and sure there are many more steps, and I'd love to hear ways that we can refine this process. But in making lands and resource decisions, we start first with selecting a topic, and that could be caribou trails, for instance. It could be about protected areas and waterways. So we try to refine a topic that we're going to work towards, particularly a location or a region on a map, and then we start to form a group of knowledgeable people who can speak to that. We always ask permission, especially before using audio, video, or pictures and ways of documenting that work. We provide an honorarium, a comfortable meeting place and refreshments, and where we can, it's often best if we can travel on the land with the folks who are telling those stories, because that is the place where we can hear those stories directly. When we record those stories, we employ interpreters who are skilled in that area of expertise. There's interpreters for healthcare, there's interpreters for government, there's interpreters for lands and resources and environment. We do the recordings in both the original language and in English, especially as we're going to be using this information. Could be at environmental hearings. It could be, and it needs to be in a language that we can both converse in. And as we gather all the information, we take the time to verify, to check back in, and report back to the same group that we're working with. And then always, at the very end especially, we know that the work is never done. We need to keep that knowledge safe and accessible for the future. And so there's always that loop back that we are looking at keeping that information that could be in media, in tape, on archives, in a location that's secure, so that if that topic comes back up again or we need to interconnect it to a future decision, we can always bring that forward too. I'll introduce the idea of the Tlicho Land Use Plan after giving you a bit of context as well of the region, and we'll zoom in. I think we've been able to make these decisions about the Tlicho Land Use Plan, particularly because the Tlicho are in a unique position of being the surface and subsurface landowners over Tlicho lands. The green line surrounding the red line is Tlicho lands. They represent 39,400 square kilometers in the Northwest Territories, surrounding the communities and surrounding the blue trails, which are the caribou trails, and the trails that Tlicho people follow to this day when hunting, when skidooing. The trails were plentiful with places along the way for Tlicho people to stop and fish, and these were like their gas stations. When you're traveling by dog team, it's important to have a place to stop and refuel. And so the trails formed the foundation not just of the land claim agreement, but later on to also form the decisions about land use planning. In the 39,000 square kilometers are the 4 communities, and these are excluded from Tlicho lands. Communities are creatures of the territory, and so they are governed by separate rules than the Tlicho government. And there's also a series of what we call donut holes. These are excluded parcels within Tlicho lands because of existing mineral interests or rights, or because of contaminated sites, which we have former mine sites on Tlicho lands, still owned by the federal government, still under obligation for cleanup. And the lands surrounding Tlicho lands, in 1921, when Chief Mofwi announced his interpretation of the treaty, he also drew a line on a map. And Mofwi Goga Denitle is what we call this green line. The direct translation is Mofui drew the line for us. This line represents the traditional trails, or the trails that the extent of travel that Tlicho people would have traveled throughout their territory. And during the treaty negotiation process leading up to 2005, decisions were made, compromises were made about that series of land. There were many Dene groups that overlapped in their traditional trails and their hunting areas. And there were groups that used this area as well. And so we have existing overlap agreements with the Tlicho, and we have an existing overlap agreement here with the Tlicho, which is another neighboring Dene group. And then we have discussions about boundary and overlap here with the Satu. And there are many groups within there. We now have discussions going on with, with Canada, granting to the Métis groups the start of land claim agreements that are starting in the Northwest Territories. With Métis groups, we have the Northwest Territory Métis Nation and the North Slave Métis Alliance, with many asserted overlapping areas as well. So you can see that this area has quite a bit going on. And just like in this morning, there was a discussion about the blanket exercise. If we were to overlap all of these areas where many people use their traditional trails, it would lead to an area the size greater than the Northwest Territories. So we have to revisit the protocols of how people use those areas in the past. Cooperation, understanding when you visited a different area that you would follow protocols, so that we can come to shared decisions together. And that's what we will get into in our land use planning discussion. But the focus right here is that the trails where people traveled was of utmost importance when starting a land claim discussion and when starting the foundation for land use planning. These trails, they weren't first documented for our land use plan. They weren't even first documented during the 1970s, the Dene and Métis mapping project. They were really passed on through stories and through oral histories, and they formed the foundation not just of the Tlicho lands decision in 2005, but of Tłįchło Government as well. So when we start with the foundation of traditional trails, that is one way to do land use planning. That is one way that we've made decisions about what is most important to protect: the Tlicho trails and the trails of the caribou or the Ekpo. In 2010, the Dene Métis mapping project trails were reconfirmed by a land use planning working group for this particular purpose of land use planning. And they represent here a snapshot in time. They do, of course, need to be revisited as animals, the environment, and the climate changes. So from the trails, we started to make the foundation for land use planning decisions. And I'll just walk through what all of the zones were. There were 5 zones that were dedicated in the decisions about all of the Tlicho lands were divided up into 5 zones. And we started with the areas that were most important to protect. So this zone, the Wek'èezhìi, is interpreted in Tlicho as cannot be touched. It is the area of most protection. It represents about 2.5% of all of Tlicho lands. It's the most restrictive zone, and the only land uses considered are camps or cabins, scientific research, and transportation corridors. Wek'èezhìi is based on 2 historical moments. In Mesa Lake, this is where a former chief of the Tlicho Edzo and a former chief from Tlicho Nation, Edzo and Tlicho made peace nearly 200 years ago in this place. So it is this blurry red blob here, which will zoom out and you can see in a bigger context. The second zone is called Hudu Zone, where the story is that Yamoza had dealings with wolverines at this hill, and it's quite a long sloping sliding hill, and there are stories about telling your fortune from sliding down that hill as well. So the first part of creating areas worth protecting was looking at the entirety and saying, what are the places with the stories? what are the places that would be impacted if that land changed? And these two were the areas identified as the most important to protect, and that's why there's the least amount of land uses there. Just around the north arm of Great Slave Lake is an area on the north shore leading towards Betchako on Tlicho land. All of the land within Tlicho land on the shoreline was zoned as Wek'èezhìi Management. This means animals living on the land. It's an area of the North Shore with a lot of migratory birds, with caribou, woodland caribou, with moose. It's an area where many people traveled on their routes between Sambake and Betchako, and they used canoes and they used dog teams in the winter to travel across the North Arm. So this area is a small fraction of Tlicho land, 0.7%, but it does represent our initiative in creating an area of protection, because just adjacent to it is an area that we are also working with the territorial government, with the Northwest Territory Métis Nation, with North Slave Métis Alliance, with the Yellowknives Dene, on protecting this area, which we are calling Dinaga Wek'èezhìi. Dinaga is the name of the island, the largest island in the North Arm of Great Slave Lake, and Wek'èezhìi in Tlicho means to be kept protected. And it sends a message when we have created on Tlicho lands an area of protection that there will be one continuous area of protection, which would not allow exploitive mineral or industrial development on the North Arm. So it also considers tourism, it considers ecocultural tourism, as well as camps or cabins, scientific research, and transportation corridors in that zone. And then we have traditional use areas, and these areas were identified as the areas which follow the trails. So there's a buffer set up around the trails, and the traditional use areas, pronounced Tłįchło Wenek'e, is protection of this one trail between Great Slave Lake and Great Bear Lake. It's the Ida Trail. It's also known more commonly as the Trails of the Ancestors. And the Tlicho have an initiative to revive these Trails of the Ancestors, bringing young people on the trails every summer. They'll actually embark in a couple of weeks to leave from all of the communities and come into Betchako. So this area is very important to protect so that the trails can continue to be revived. And so in addition to all the uses allowed above, we would also allow hydro power generation and utility corridors in this area. And then the fourth zone is called Tlicho Wenek'e Det Ahoti. It means use of land. The same uses are considered as for the Ida Trail. And the point here is to preserve Mofui's trails as he followed the caribou, just as the Tlicho today followed the caribou through the trails. And so after all of the zones were decided on what was going to be protected and what uses weren't going to be allowed, the remaining area spaces in between, they form the final zone, which is Asi Hauga Enahoto, which means it's open to live on. And this zone is called the Enhanced Management Zone. It does not mean that we are open for development in all of the areas all at the same time. It means that it's the only zone where it may be considered for other additional development uses. And so that means quarries or commercial forestry, hunting or fishing lodges, mineral, oil, and gas exploration and development. And we share the 5 zones and the way these were created with you so that we can give you an understanding of how the Tlicho Land Use Plan starts first with the foundation of what's most important to protect, because it protects the Tlicho language, culture, way of life. It took a long time to create that, to finalize these decisions, to go through a working group. It took 7 years. From the signing of the Tlicho Agreement and the ratification in 2005 until 2013, when the Tlicho Land Use Plan was approved as Tlicho law. And those lawmaking abilities, they come from the Tlicho Agreement. And So I'll introduce the Tlicho Agreement to give you the background of how this is probably a unique situation and could also have some elements that can be taken to other areas and replicated if you are working with First Nations that are making decisions about land use planning. So I mentioned several land claim agreements that were settled in the Northwest Territories as modern land claim agreements. And for the Tlicho, the modern treaty was made between Canada and the government of the Northwest Territories and the Tlicho ratified in 2005. It's viewed as the reconciliation of the numbered treaty, of Treaty 11 from 1921. And Chief Mofwey's definition of the treaty: as long as the sun rises and the river flows, the land does not move, we will not be restricted from our way of life. So the agreement establishes the Tlicho self-government, and with it the responsibilities to establish mechanisms for preparing, approving, and implementing land use planning for the 39,400 square kilometers of Tlicho lands. Within the Tlicho government, there is a leadership of a Grand Chief and 4 chiefs elected by each of the communities that form our Chiefs Executive Council. And then the councils from each of the 4 communities send 2 council members to form an assembly. And together that is the lawmaking body of the Tlicho government. And so when the Tlicho Land Use Plan was adopted into law, it was approved in 2013 by this lawmaking body. But the Land Use Plan took, as I mentioned, 7 years of foundations to get there, and 7 years of collaboration. So with a foundation of traditional knowledge, an understanding of those trails and the importance of protecting areas, we formed a land use planning elders working group, and we were imparted to bring on youth onto this land use planning working group. So I have a picture of Ingamati. Antonia Drynack was one of the youth scribes learning about working with elders and collecting traditional knowledge, and she's now a member of our Tlicho government as a staff member. We have an interpreter who is doing simultaneous live translation. It was very important to buy the technology that allowed us to do that, so that every meeting we go to, we have a whisper-like kit where interpreters are whispering in not just the elders' ears, but in our ears as well, every time there's information to convey. And we also held annual tours throughout the communities. So that means visiting all of the communities every year of the 7 years of the land use plan creation, to sit with the community members, to sit with the working group, but also to sit with the chiefs and the council members from each of the 4 communities. And to hear the messages, to really hear about protection of important values, important pieces of land, and important stories. The ownership of Tlicho land, surface and subsurface, allows us to make decisions and provide the certainty of the land ownership. This morning we were talking about zoning and thinking about how zoning is a construct of our planning profession, a recent construct actually, and how in indigenizing processes and systems, we can also think of ways of bringing the idea of the whole ecosystem to zoning. And this is one of those ways to think about how certain zones, especially the zone that is open to development, can provide those future opportunities for economic development for people. I think that is a really big foundation. So while we've created land use plans for Tlicho lands, and 2 of the Tlicho communities, Betchiko and Wati, have land use plans, there still remains public lands in Wek'èezhìi where there is currently no land use plan. And when we zero in, I was speaking about these overlap agreements, and you can sort of see some of the colors here. The orange is an overlap area of asserted Akecho territory and Tlicho territory. The hashed gray is where there is already established an overlap agreement. So an understanding of how decisions would be made that affect lands and resources in these hashed overlap areas. There are the surrounding lands in the Wek'èezhìi boundary, which was defined as the boundary for co-management. And there exists right now 2 co-management boards in Wek'èezhìi that govern decisions about renewable resources. So that's animals and plants, as well as a land and water board for Wek'èezhìi, and these are outcomes of the Mackenzie Valley Resource Management Act to set up the foundation for co-management boards in the Northwest Territories. With our overlapping settled, unsettled, and asserted land claims, and with many parties desiring equal and decision-making authorities and opportunities, with concurrent processes like our range plans for caribou, establishment of protected areas like the protected area on the North Arm, and with environmental assessments of diamond mines and other all-season roads, we see that there are many lessons to be learned and many challenges too. We have a precedent in regional planning in the Northwest Territories of it being very slow and expensive. It takes upwards of 10 or 15 years to create land use plans where you have many of these challenges of overlapping decision making. And it takes funding as well. It takes partners coming together and sourcing that funding from many different areas. So what we have done together is to work in collaboration with the treaty partners, the Government of Northwest Territories and the Government of Canada. We have been working collaboratively with GNWT since 2014 on scoping our options to develop a land use planning mechanism that is the framework for land use planning in the Wek'èezhìi region. And we've recommended that a team be formed with our treaty partners to develop the land use planning mechanism, establish that, and then implement what that framework is. And we view this framework as the next steps in our reconciliation of the treaty. So the Tlicho Agreement does provide instructions to all the signatories of the Tlicho Agreement that we will consult each other in the preparation of our land use plans for any part in Wek'èezhìi, with a view to sharing information and harmonizing our plans. The Tlicho government and just like the territorial government in Canada, we want to see a land use plan for Wek'èezhìi. We support the land use plan which recognizes the Tlicho's right to self-government for protection of traditional lands and waters and language and culture and way of life. And just like the Tlicho land use plan was developed in collaboration, the story that I've shared with you of how we developed the Tlicho land use plan, we feel these foundational steps are a requirement for the Wek'èezhìi land use plan and requires the meaningful participation of Tlicho as equal decision makers with its treaty partners. So the region, the traditional area, is home to many areas of importance of cultural heritage values and opportunities to promote and preserve and protect the Tlicho way of life.